as anathema to what they believe in. And it's right that people, if he's going to be here and have the red carpet, and our own government isn't going to offer moral leadership, then it's right that we show moral leadership in the streets. Because otherwise what we have is Donald Trump using Britain as a PR coup, as a PR spectacle, to show his own people, look how respected we are, look how great we've made America. Instead, we're going to make it clear that actually we stand against what he represents, and we will confront the bigotry he represents as well.
Owen, thank you very much, and we're going to hear a different point of view now, because just approaching us, and I can just ask Sarah to come in behind the mic. Thank you very much. Sarah Elliott, Chair of Republicans Overseas UK. Thanks for joining us as well. You caught some of what Owen Jones was saying. What's your response to him?
Well, it sounds like it's more of a PR stunt for him to get attention for himself. I mean, the President of the United States is coming. He's the head of state of UK's greatest ally and the UK's single biggest investor here in the UK. So I really think it's very appropriate for the President to be here. I think these protests are just a distraction. They'll be a sideshow. At the end of the day, the special relationship will endure, because regardless of who's president or prime minister, we have so much in common between our two countries.
But it will endure in spite of, not because of Donald Trump, is that a lot of people would say. Do you accept that?
Well, I think it's endured over many different bumps in the road over the past couple hundred years. I mean, we didn't start off the best of friends in 1776, and look at where we are now. So I think President Trump actually comes at a very pivotal time in the UK's history here, because the UK is about to leave the EU in a couple months' time, and I think he'd like to walk away with a free trade deal from the UK.
Well, you say that the US is the UK's greatest ally, but the relationship, the personal relationship between Theresa May him and Theresa May has been a rather seesaw one, hasn't it? They held hands famously, infamously, depending on your perspective, at the White House, but then they've had some really public clashes, notably over Theresa May's criticism of him retweeting the comments of a far-right group here in the UK. So do you really think that something tangible is going to be achieved here on trade, when even the US ambassador just a few days ago was saying the notion of a trade deal with the US is up in the air because of the Chequers agreement?
Well, I think that's why it's up in the air. It's not because of President Trump. It's because the UK and this government has to decide if they really want to separate from the EU and be open to the rest of the world and be global Britain, or do they want to stay in a customs union with the EU? I mean, the US right now has experienced the most economic growth it has had in over 20 years, historically low unemployment rates for African Americans and Hispanics at 3.8% nationwide. Doesn't the UK want to get a piece of that and be part of the economic growth?
In a line, do you welcome the fact that there will be protests tomorrow in terms of democracy?
Of course, absolutely. I mean, everyone has the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression. That's part of being in a free country. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump's legacy will last longer than a balloon in the air. And quite frankly, he's going to get reelected in 2020.
Sarah Elliott, Chair of Republicans Overseas UK, thank you very much for your time as well. Lots of people watching with great interest for what Donald Trump says over the next few days, and indeed what he says after this visit to the UK when he meets President Putin in Helsinki in a few days' time. For now, from Regent's Park, it's back to you.
Anita, thank you very much. Yes, Donald Trump expected here, coming in on Chopper, Marine One, around 7:30 this evening. There will be guards from the Welsh Guards, the Scots Guards and the Irish Guards from the Household Division who will play him in as he arrives, and there will be a black tie dinner, as I was saying a little earlier, with 150 of the top CEOs in the country. Not much sign of the protests here in Woodstock, adjacent to Blenheim Palace. Very tight police presence. Let's speak to Jack Straw, former Labour MP, who was UK Foreign Secretary between 2001 and 2006. Good to have you with us, Mr. Straw. And I was thinking, not the first US president to face protests like this. In the teeth of the Iraq crisis in 2003, George W. Bush came to the UK and faced similar protests. How did you handle that?
Well, I was in the middle of those, as it were. I was on the inside of the cordon, not the outside. Yes, President Bush did come in November 2003, and there were quite significant protests, for sure. But visit went off really without incident, and that visit was a formal state visit. So President Bush and Secretary of State Colin Powell were staying at Buckingham Palace, and they were able to do that. So my sense is that the protests, although they were very strong for understandable reasons because of people's feeling about the Iraq War, that they were more muted than it appears these protests against Donald Trump are likely to be.
And where do you stand on this visit, Jack Straw? Are you in favour of it? Do you think we should be honouring the office rather than the man that occupies it?
I'm in favour of diplomacy, and if you're in favour of diplomacy, you can't pick and choose the different countries who elect different leaders. I heard Owen Jones saying that President Trump was not elected by a plurality, a majority of voters. Well, that happens to be arithmetically true. He got 3 million fewer votes than did Hillary Clinton. On the other hand, he was democratically elected by their system of an electoral college, state by state. So would I, if I were in Theresa May or Jeremy Hunt's seat, be in favour of this visit? Yes, I would be, because I think that the idea that you should simply turn your back on Britain's closest ally and one with whom we trade for 20% of our global trade and have huge investments both ways, the idea of that is nonsense. On the other hand, people are fully entitled to protest, both here and as they would be in the United States, and these two are not incompatible.
No, absolutely. But just taking the politics of Brexit out of the equation for a moment, this is a delicate time for Theresa May, and if you were currently the Foreign Secretary, you would be nervous of a visitor like this, prone to the unpredictable statement and perhaps the more embarrassing statements when it comes to what he's just been saying about Brexit over in Brussels.
Well, I mean, I think we now can predict the unpredictability of Donald Trump. That the almost certainty is that he's going to say something left field, if you like. So I think that's, as it were, to use a bit of jargon, it's in the share price. Everybody knows that's what's going to happen. In Jeremy Hunt, we have someone who's pretty sober, stable, an ally of the Prime Minister. I mean, I'm a different party, of course, but it's just worth saying those things. So I think that Mr. Hunt will take the visit in his stride, and there's a huge amount to talk about, as there always is with American presidents, whether we happen to agree with them or not on particular issues. I don't think you can put Brexit to one side, unfortunately. I mean, would that there had been a different result 2 years ago, but there wasn't. And the consequence of that and the absence of a Conservative majority, any majority for the government, means we're now in the predicament, the mess that we're in with, I'm afraid, a gravely weakened British government and us facing national humiliation. And it's very striking. I was sitting in the square in Blackburn yesterday watching the game on a big screen, and I was struck by a number of people who came up to me who plainly voted for Brexit, who are now really worried about the consequences for our country. So trying to straighten our relationship out with the United States is really an important part of how we go forward from this current mess.
Jack Straw, always good to get your thoughts. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. Let me just tell you some of the people that are on the invite list tonight. You'll see perhaps Richard Nod, who's the European boss of Goldman Sachs, Steve Hatch from Facebook UK, Jess Staley, who's the chief executive of Barclays. So that tells you that there's a certain element of the finance world involved, who have ties, of course, to the United States, but also food and drink, high-tech, defence, these sort of industries that have a lot at stake at the moment. And no doubt they'll be trying to impress on the president just how important free trade across the Atlantic really is. The paradox of this president, of course, is that he's a fervent believer of free trade, but he's the one at the moment putting up the barriers in this ongoing trade war, not only with China, but also with the European Union. So it'd be interesting to watch what sort of reaction he gets from these business leaders tonight. There was one, incidentally, Baroness Martha Lane Fox, the founder of lastminute.com, who said, I can quite understand why the UK government has to entertain Donald Trump, but I don't have to, and she's turned down her invitation. Well, let's cross now to our correspondent Duncan Kennedy, who is on the outskirts of Blenheim Palace, closer to it than I am, Duncan.
I am, Christian. I'm actually right at the front gate of Blenheim Palace. You might just be able to see it over my shoulder here. This beautiful palace set in the Oxfordshire countryside, built in 1705, the ancestral home of the Churchills. Donald Trump, of course, has got a bust of Winston Churchill in the Oval Office, And of course, this is the birthplace of Winston Churchill. But today, people here don't want to discuss history. They want to discuss the present, the here and the now, Donald Trump. And we reckon about 200 to 300 people have gathered here at the front gate. This is the main protest site for this palace visit by Donald Trump. He's here in a couple of hours' time, but already people are getting their voices heard, trying to shout at all the traffic, trying to make their voices heard, music, a kind of a semi-party atmosphere, if you like. We've plucked 2 people from the crowd here to get their views on why they're here to protest against Donald Trump. This is Amelia, this is Barry. Let's start with you, Amelia. What is it about Donald Trump? Why are you here to protest?
Everything, essentially. So to start with, he's sort of very egotistical, and I think he's incredibly self-promoting, doesn't believe in any of his policies. But on top of that, the way that he's portraying everything, it's making America such a backward country, and it's moving against everything that we've moved towards.
Is it the man or the policies you object to?
Both. Well, definitely the policies in recent times, especially against women, that he's started promoting, and the immigration policies I'm so against. But also him as a person, the way he tweets, the way he goes about things, I think it's so counterproductive and it's so old-fashioned, it's awful.
Well, on immigration, he'd say, look, yeah, I listen to public opinion, I reverse that whole idea of splitting up parents and their children. I'm more sensitive than people think.
No, I definitely think that isn't the case. I think in that case, he's promoting himself rather than anything like that, because you can't say that. It's not true.
Barry, you're